Hello. Good morning. Welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. If you're coming into this live, you'll be able to hear in the background Paul Anderson's original piece, Piccola's Bluest Eye. This is appropriate, I think, because today we're going to read through and discuss Toni Morrison's work on, or her speech. It actually was a speech that she gave. She received the Nobel Prize for Literature, which was, and there aren't really higher achievements in literature than, there are some other prizes, but to be recognized in this way says quite a bit about Toni Morrison, and I think it's interesting because she chose to give her lecture, her speech, on language itself. So it's appropriate, it's a good pairing with Burke on Terministic Screens. I think that they take different attitudes towards this question of what language does. They're not answering that question. I'm kind of putting that question to these pieces, putting them in conversation. I don't think that they would necessarily disagree with one another, but that their basic attitudes might be a little different about how to approach the question of language and usage and what it does to us and what we do with it. So, of course, she wrote many novels, Toni Morrison novels, one of them being The Bluest Eye. Therefore, but also probably Beloved is maybe her most famous novel, and lots of novels. She wrote other pieces. She wrote nonfiction as well. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature. She wrote a lot. So this one, I think we should take it with as much seriousness as you would take someone's reflections on their craft. So you heard someone who was a great general. They wrote a strategy manual. I think it would change how you related to it if it was just some kind of academic who was thinking about strategy versus someone who had really worked in that field, or someone who was a plumber writing about adventures in plumbing, whatever your field is. So we all kind of share language. We all share language in that we all speak it. And I once went to a talk by Ben Lerner, who is a poet. He was a really charming guy. And he wrote a book called The Hatred of Poetry. And but he had a little essay on it first that he was kind of trying out in this small group where we were. And his argument in The Hatred of Poetry, or one of the arguments, is poets kind of claim for themselves, like, I work in language. Everyone speaks, though. And this is also a criticism, the ancient criticism of rhetoric. You're like, okay, Gorgias, you teach rhetoric, but what's unique about it? Everyone speaks. All of these crafts speak. What's unique about it? I think Toni Morrison would be someone whose relationship to language is really deep, because when you have to write a creative work, and there's not something that you have to say, you nevertheless have to find what you need to say. That teaches you things about language. And of course, and she mastered this. So we're going to read some of her reflections. If you're here and in the chat, welcome. Happy to field any questions or comments, discussions that you'd want to have. It's usually best if they have something to do with what the stream is about, but often they don't, and that's fine too. So welcome if you work here in the live version. So let's take a look at what Toni Morrison has to say. So this was given in 1993. She won the Nobel Prize. And you can listen to an audio recording of her speaking it, which would be a lot better than me reading it, but I, rather than pausing, starting, and stopping, I'm just going to read it, and then if you want like a fuller version of it, check out how she has a nice sounding voice too. I mean, you're quite alien to the topic. Hey, what's up, aliens? Yeah, welcome back. No, yours aren't. I think that you're always giving me good stuff to think, like VPs. So here's Toni Morrison. It begins with a quote, so she's already beginning in a way. I think I might close my window, because like, no matter what time I start doing this, it's always the moment when some neighbor of mine revs up a power tool. Every single time. Just every single time. Last night, we did like a opera night. The minute start the recording of the opera, somebody's like, just a motorcycle parade goes by for like 30 minutes. What's going on? All right. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind but wise. She moves out of. So she begins by telling a story. She's a storyteller. Or was it an old man? A guru, perhaps, or a griot soothing restless children. I've heard this story, or one exactly like it, in the lore of several cultures. So why is this Murphy's Law? Yeah, it's that thing. But not really, because things are going better. They could go a lot worse. Faceless old woman? I don't know if it's faceless. So that's I remember that from last time when you spooked me out with that. But I wonder if they kind of are drawing on a similar, the idea of like the ancient woman who has some kind of wisdom. They're totally faceless. Maybe it's like a dark wisdom. Yes, there's something about like blindness and wisdom and the lore of many cultures. In fact, a lot of times poets are imagined. Legendary poets are imagined as Homer. Famously was imagined as blind. And John Milton really was blind, but went blind. Dictate his poems to others. So there's this connection between blindness and literature, which might be strange because we think about literature as reading rather than speaking. Wisdom and blindness. I think there might be people who would say this association of blindness and wisdom is maybe insensitive to people who are suffering from blindness. I don't think she means that that's something that you have to, way that you relate to real people. But there is something in folklore where there are often kinds of images that have deep significance that isn't the significance that that's how you should relate to people in the real world. So I think that it's worth distinction. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind, wise. In the version I know, the woman is the daughter of slaves. Black, American, lives alone in a small house outside of town. Her reputation for wisdom is without peer and question. Among her people, she is both the law and its transgression. Just stop there for a moment. If you think about a lot of smaller, like village life, something like that, or the life in a rural area where there's maybe more remote from a lot of institutions, and in many ancient cultures, the character of the judge was often someone who was a storyteller, or someone who was wise, not necessarily someone who was an appointed authority by a state or something, because the forms of organization and smaller form of life don't always have that level of bureaucratic structure. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. So that's something to think of. What does she mean that saying, among her people she is both a law and its transgression? Not totally sure. It makes me think of a few. The honor she is paid and the awe in which she is held reach beyond her neighborhood to places far away. The city where the intelligence of rural prophets is the source of much. People in the city, oh yeah, the wise old women, they don't get it. Okay. One day the woman is visited by some young people who seem to be bent on disproving her clairvoyance. Clairvoyance meaning powers of prophecy, and showing her up for the fraud they believe she is. Their plan is simple. They enter her house, they ask the one question, the answer to which rides solely on her difference from them, a difference they regard as a profound disability, blindness. It might be worth to kind of keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the speech, that they ask a question that relies on her difference from them. They stand before her, and one of them says, "Old woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me whether it is living or dead." So they're kind of mocking this woman, right? Like, oh, you're so wise, you can prophesy. All the rest of us can plainly see whether this bird is alive or dead, but you can't because you're blind. They're kind of sticking it to her. It's kind of cruel, really, isn't it? To do something like that. I think there's sometimes people who like to debunk things that they think are pseudoscientific. And I think there can be virtues in debunking. That it helps us kind of see past charlatanism and things like that sometimes. But I think sometimes the approach is a way of feeling good about being cruel, not fully understanding where they're coming. It's an interesting problem. How do we gently and carefully approach the areas of life that for us feel like superstition? Maybe there is superstition involved, but maybe the roots of that superstition are things that people deeply care about in their world, and therefore we have to kind of approach it in some way that's not just to make fun, both because it might be cruel to do that, but also because they're probably not going to change their minds if you just kind of make fun of them. So a lot of cultures have this theory of the evil eye. Well, why is that the case? Why do people want to protect their children from the evil? That goes really deep. It's not something you just be like, there's no randomized controlled trial that shows that that's true. That's not going to really address the place that people are have that kind of. How could we do that? Sure. But I know it's not that. So she still doesn't answer. She is blind and cannot see her visitors, let alone what is in their hands. She does not know their color, gender, or homeland. She only knows their motive. This is a nice point where Morrison and Burke are kind of in very different ways approaching this same question. Burke was talking about indeterministic screens, how the big idea with what makes someone human is that they act as opposed to just move. Actions have motives. Here, the woman is wise precisely because whatever else she doesn't know, she does know motives. She understands a lot about you. I think that's kind of where it goes, this idea. The old woman's silence is so long, the young people have trouble holding their laughter. Finally, she speaks, and her voice is soft but stern. I don't know, she says. Oh, the threshold for the audio is a little high. That's good. Thank you for telling me that. Let me see if I can adjust that quickly. That's weird. You know, it's weird because little environmental things. Is that any better? Any better, Alien? I wonder where that is, because I haven't really changed anything. Setup. If it does that again, oh, maybe I'm seeing it happen. Maybe I'm just like, oh, seems a little bit better. I just turned the gain down a little. Maybe I turned it up for something. Lots of little. I don't know. That's exactly where we're. I said I was going to do this highlighting. I don't know, she says. I don't know whether the bird you're dead or alive. But what I do know is that it is in your hand. It is in your. Her answer can be taken to mean, if it is dead, you have either found it that way or you have killed it. If it is alive, still kill it. Whether it is to stay alive is your decision. Whatever the case. Oh, it sounds worse now. Huh. It's really weird. Let me try something else. I guess I just got cocky. Usually I put headphones in to see what I'm sounding like. So, it sounds now. Alright. But I mean, this is still not what the... Alright, let me try. Alright. Is it better now? Okay. I'm gonna keep going. If it's really bad, let me know. Maybe I'll just have... You aren't directly talking to the mic. Okay, well that's an easy problem to solve. I'll just talk right in. Maybe I'll turn the gain back. Yeah. Okay. That shouldn't be too. Thanks for helping me out. Do you want to be a mod for this channel? I don't think it's really necessary at this point, but if you do, you're the first in line, aliens. So interested in a duty. Um. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Just the threshold. Yeah, I tried to fix some of that on my OBS, but yeah, there's so much to learn about this that I experiencing all of the ways. Not sure. Maybe I should learn a little bit more about what's causing this. It's been good for a while. Okay. For parading their power and helplessness, the young visitors are reprimanded, told they are responsible not only for the act of mockery, but also for the small bundle of life sacrificed to achieve. Noise suppression? I don't think I have noise suppression on. Any theories about why, where, let me look in. Huh, maybe I'll try this. Oh, you're saying Twitch automatically does that? Presses the noise. So maybe I should just speak closer to the mic. That might solve the problem. Oh, the gate. Yeah. Okay. I'll work on it next time. I think I'm just gonna keep going because I kind of only have this time to do it, and I don't want to spend, like, if this video comes out and it's just me talking about noise, you know, it's not going to be too good. So I'm just going to keep going. But thanks for letting me know, and then I might ask you stuff in the Discord about it. If maybe you can help me with figuring out why it's happening. But it might just be because again, there's like a noisy environment around me, and so the mic is kind of making decisions about what to pick up that are not best for me. Okay. So for parading their power and helplessness, the visitors are reprimanded. No. Thank you for letting me know. Are reprimanded, told they are not responsible, not only for the act of mockery, but also for the small bundle of life sacrificed to achieve its aims. The blind woman shifts attention away from the assertions of power to the instrument through which that power is exercised. So she's already kind of taking this little story and elaborating its significance. I think that this sentence in particular is a really cool way of thinking about why. So if we can kind of give it away already, the little bird here for Morrison is going to be language. Blind woman shifts attention away, and the blind woman in this case will be her. Blind woman shifts attention away from assertions of power to the instrument through which that power is exercised. So moving away from this relationship of the person that can see and the one that can't see, and what would that mean in terms of language? Focusing on how language itself exercises power. That's a hint of what's to come. Speculation on what, other than its own frail body, that bird in the hand might signify, has always been attractive to me, but especially so now thinking, as I have been, about the work I do that has brought me to this company. So I choose to read the bird as language and the woman as a practiced writer. She is worried about how the language she dreams in, given to her at birth, is handled, put into service, even withheld from her for certain nefarious purposes. Being a writer, thinks of language partly as a system, partly as a living thing over which one has control, but mostly as agency, as an act with consequences. And this is very similar to what we get with Burke. I wonder if Morrison had read Burke. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me. He was one of the foremost literary critics in the United States. She was at least one generation younger than him. So, but they could have crossed paths. Lots of possibilities. But the idea of, but it's not unique to Burke. It's not like he came up with the idea. Language as symbolic action, as he says. So that's what Morrison is saying too. That writers think of language mostly as an agency, something you act with. Something that you act with. So the question the children put to her is it living or dead, is not unreal because she thinks of language as susceptible to death, erasure, certainly imperiled and salvageable only by an effort of the will. What would it mean if a language died? Well, on one hand, we could think about, if we're going to be very literal-minded, we could say, of course, we have dead languages now. Isn't Latin a dead language? Well, there are a bunch of kind of weirdos that get together and speak Latin, and maybe that's a fun and cool thing. I'm not talented enough to do that. But I think that there also are languages that are going out of existence because they're indigenous languages and they're not recorded. But I don't think that here, when she's talking about language, she only means national language, or only means languages as they are, languages in the terms of English, Spanish, Swahili. That's not the only kind of language she's thinking about. She's thinking about languages, certain forms of discourse that are more or less, that hang together in some way. I think so. She's using language in a looser sense here than a specific national language. She believes that if the bird in the hands of her visitors is dead, the custodians are responsible for the corpse. Custodians being people who take care of something. Sometimes people think this means the janitor. The idea of a custodian being called that is that there's someone who takes care of the building. So we can be custodians of anything. Who is the custodian of language? Who cares for it? Who kind of, once it's dead, it's not really brought back in the same way. Kind of like remaking extinct dinosaurs. I think that's a really good point. Yeah. I mean, you can see that especially with, there's been so much attention of various ancient languages to Latin. For a number of reasons, historical reasons. But one of the projects was, how do you pronounce language? A language that no one speaks anymore. And this guy Erasmus spent a lot of time thinking about pronunciation and made some good arguments and kind of established a pronunciation. But there's no perfect way of knowing how accurate that pronunciation would be. And of course, pronunciations in real languages vary on the basis of who's speaking them, what kinds of communities. And so any kind of attempt to like resurrect something, and we should keep that in mind when we think about history, that history always includes some fiction, necessarily, because it's always incomplete. And the attempt to kind of connect the dots, which is necessary for us to understand it, should be thought of more as like that diorama of the dinosaur at the Natural History Museum, and not like the dinosaur walking. You always have to make guesses, and that's not a bad thing. You just have to keep it in mind. So for her, a dead language is not only one no longer spoken or written, like Latin, or I guess not really like Hittite or something like that. It is unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. Unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. Language that's static, stiff. Maybe if you work in a workplace that's really bureaucratic, you have these phrases that are kind of constantly said, that are never really examined. And if I went to a faculty meeting and I said, "What do we really mean by curriculum?" Everyone would just stare at me blankly. Be like, "We mean the courses that we offer." But I mean, like, okay, but are the courses that we offer always a curriculum simply because we offer them? Do they really have that idea of a full course of education in them? Isn't that part of the idea of a curriculum? But these kinds of things wouldn't make sense because this language, this bureaucratic language, is really unyielding. And in fact, as she says, a beautiful phrase, content to admire its own paralysis. Why is the language being personified in that way? That's a good question. I think one of the reasons why is Morrison here wants to talk about language and its effects as being distinct from maybe like the particular purposes of individual speakers. And kind of like with Burke. Yeah, something that has agency in itself. It's almost like you've been coming to the stream for a while. You're finishing my sentences for me. Exactly. It's something which has agency in itself. So just Burke's idea of terministic screens is kind of, these terminologies have consequences when you adopt speaking in a certain way. And Morrison has a similar idea. I mean, hers is even more poetic, I would say, of this kind of, this bird. So the bird might be a tool or a purpose for these young kids in the story, for their cruel purposes. But the bird itself was or is a life. And how should we relate to it if we think about it as living, as something that we have responsibility to? It's not just that we have responsibility to each other when we speak, not to say mean things like that, but we have a responsibility to language. The language that we speak. What would that be? I mean, it's kind of a strange idea. I don't think it's something that so you kind of need to use this fiction, and of course she's a writer of fiction and has deep respect for it. You need to use this fiction of language as an agency that in order to get to some of these big questions. But maybe it's not as fictional as it seems. Maybe there is not the sense that it's you could sometimes, people say things like the real organism is not the ant but the ant hill. You can't, you actually better understand the relationships, the biological functions, if you think of the anthill as an organ. And you might think of language in the same way. Okay, well, what if we actually thought of language as a living system, and its speakers merely as its organs, various transformations? You might get a different view of language if you thought about it that way. I'm not saying that's the way she's thinking about it or the way you ought to think about it. It's just a way you might think of it. So, like statist language, censored and censoring. So statist language here, she might be thinking about, kind of a Stalinist state repression, where many of really right after the Russian Revolution, 17, and into the 20s, there were a lot of really crazily experimental artists in theater and art and poetry, Mayakovsky. There's so many different Soviet artists doing really experimental stuff. The avant-garde art and literature, there probably wasn't any other place. Paris always, of course, to some level, maybe other places too. But it was really in Russia where really avant-garde. But after Stalin's cultural policies came into play, some of that began to freeze. Kind of had to say certain things. You didn't, there were consequences. And some people were still able to do things within that system. Shostakovich, various composers. But it was a lot harder. So, ruthless in its policing duties, it has no desire or purpose other than maintaining the free range of its own narcotic narcissism. And the kind of narcissism that kind of dulls you, numbs you. Yeah, it is true about a lot. Yeah, for sure. Narcotic narcissism. I like this. Its own exclusivity and dominance. So there's certain kinds of languages that develop, and we can feel that they're the language of a dominant group, dominant system. And a lot of times, other languages, like the discourse of people who are, I don't love the term marginalized. I think it kind of maybe it only becomes one of these official terms at a certain point. But for the lack of a better term, say marginalized languages that are far more creative. And so, and people are recognizing this now, where a lot of the slang that's become popular recently, let's say on Twitter, language Twitter, when people have traced it back, they're like, why? This is all stuff that was said by queer black community, or the trans community, coming from these places, and then it gets adopted, and then it transforms in its meaning, because who's speaking it? Yeah, she knows quite a bit about alliteration. Toni Morrison's prose is musical. There's a lot of attention to the sounds of words, and she talks about this in some interviews. She's it really is. So yeah, alliteration is something that she's more rhetorical than a lot of fiction writers, and I that's one of the reasons I really respect her writing, is that she doesn't shy away from these linguistic effects. For her, these aren't things that are kind of over and above story, as this modernist idea of that's what real literature is. It's just the narrative. No, it's the language. That's kind of why she's focusing on this in her Nobel Prize speech. So we might think of language as the natural topic for such a speech, but you could talk about all sorts of other things. You could talk about the tradition, or you could talk about narratives and stories, and she does do a little bit of that. She really is focused on language. I think that's one of the things that she's best known for as a writer. So, however moribund, how do you explain moribund? Let's go to our handy etymology dictionary. Kind of on its deathbed is kind of the image I get when I think about moribund. About to die, in a dying state, from French moribund, from Latin moribundus, dying, at the point of death, from mori to die. Figurative sense of near an end. You can kind of feel that sometimes cultural things are moribund. They're not really vital anymore. They don't really speak to the moment. Kind of an echo of some past idea. It's just being repeated over. However moribund, it is not without effect, for it actively thwarts the intellect, stalls conscience, suppresses human potential. So she's saying these kind of dead official languages, state language, bureaucratic language, aren't just bad, aren't just kind of poor. They don't just do they don't just fail to do what literary language can. They actively, as she says, thwart the intellect, stalls conscience, and suppresses human potential. One word that you might use here is they're stultifying. They make us stupider. Not in the sense of, sometimes people like to say things like, they make us, oh wow, that looking at that made me stupider. But what does it really mean to make you stupider? It's not this question of like your native intelligence, do your IQ points go up or down? But if we think about intelligence relating to, let's go back again to the etymology dictionary of intelligence. What is intelligence? The highest faculty of the mind, blah, 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 blah. From Old French intelligence, directly from Latin intelligentia, understanding, knowledge, the power of discerning, art, skill, taste. So if intelligence isn't just your ability to know a lot of things, but it's your ability to make distinctions, ability to understand, that actively would, if you only have one word to describe all of these differences, then it changes how you think. And you do become less intelligent. You're less sensitive to differences. That's a big problem. That's not a small problem. It's a big problem. Unreceptive to interrogation, questioning, not necessarily like police interrogation. It cannot form or tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts, tell another story, fill baffling silences. Official language, smitheried to sanction ignorance. Smitheried, you don't hear that word very much. Tailor-made to sanction ignorance and preserve privilege, is a suit of armor polished to shocking glitter. So it's defensive. It might look pretty. It might kind of say the right things. A lot of times people are now upset about political correctness. And I think that sometimes this is used as a way of silencing the real concerns that people have about injustice. It's just precisely the kinds of things that Toni Morrison is concerned about. But I think at the same time, there might be part of, in the way that some of these things are discussed, that are too static. And they lead us to a kind of brittle moralism. And I think that Toni Morrison would say the same thing too, that the defensiveness might come from the state, but it also could potentially come from people who are locked in a battle with forces that oppress them as well. I think it can go either way. Yet there it is. Dumb, predatory, sentimental. Exciting reverence in school children, providing shelter for despots, summoning false memories of stability, harmony among the public. I like this first one, though, exciting reverence in school children. That's the correct term. That's the correct answer. Rather than being like, sometimes I just do an exercise in my class, be like, how many other terms could we? Let's pretend synonyms exist. Well, let's see all the different synonyms that we get. And then let's now realize that there are no synonyms. All of these terms have slightly different meanings, even in the abstract, and even more different meanings when they're... Roman Jakobson, the great linguist, wrote against synonymy. He's like, synonymy is not a function of language. It's a function of ideology about language. That words have the same meaning. No, not only do words not have the same meaning, anytime you use the word, it has a different meaning at some kind of extension or scope. And that can send you into a dizzy, because if we're used to thinking about meanings, what the dictionary captures, then it might be like, well, every time I use a word, is it completely different? No, it's not completely different. But it's not exactly the same either. She is convinced that when language dies, out of carelessness, disuse, indifference, and absence of esteem, or killed by fiat, there are a lot of places, especially in colonial experiences, where certain languages were not allowed to be spoken anymore. You had to speak English. India or South Africa or Ireland had to speak English. does relate to that national language at some level, but also to all the creativity and uniqueness that was suppressed when one national language came over another in some form of communication. And it's weird because on the one hand, now that English is a global language, it does make possible broader communication between cultures, but it still carries that residue of, well, why is English that language? It's not an inherent property of English being more intelligible. It's a history of colonialism. The fact that the English Empire, the sun never sets on it, right? Well, yeah. In her country, children have bitten their tongues off and used bullets instead to iterate the voice of speechlessness, of disabled and disabling language, of language adults have abandoned altogether as a device for grappling with meaning, providing guidance, or expressing love. But she knows tongue suicide is not only the choice of children. It is common among the infantile heads of state and power merchants whose evacuated language. You could hear that evacuated in two senses. Evacuated meaning has no content, or evacuated in the sense of you evacuate your bowels. Take a big shit. Whose evacuated language leaves them with no access to what is left of their human instincts, for they speak only to those who obey, or in order to force obedience. You have to obey language. Sometimes people in internet debates will get into these places where they're like, well, that's not what the word means. And they refuse to kind of continue to interact with someone because they get really hung up on the fact that someone doesn't really obey the meaning of the word. And this is one version of an authoritarian take on language. Now, it doesn't mean that people can, that when we're engaging with people, they'll be like, oh yeah, it's this kind of Humpty Dumpty theory of language. Words can mean whatever I want. That's just a kind of, that's an even more extreme form of authoritarianism. Because language comes out between people, but it doesn't mean that, you know, that the one person who has a different understanding must be kind of completely shunned or berated until they fall in line with the dominant meaning of a term. You might kind of come to better understanding if you say, well, why do you think it means that? Where does that usage come from? Where do you hear that word being used that way? I haven't heard it like that. Maybe you'll come to better understand. So, systematic looting of language can be recognized by the tendency of its users to forego its nuanced, complex, midwifery properties for menace and subjugation. Nuanced, complex midwifery. Let's just remind ourselves what a midwife is. A midwife, in much of history and in most cultures, was often a woman, almost always a woman, who would assist with birth, who would help someone kind of come forward with their own progeny. And that might, if you say that for language or for ideas, we can help each other think. If we took the position of a midwife of being like, I want to better understand what you have to say. Now, I might not like the look of your child when it comes out. You know, I'm not going to say that all babies are beautiful. Not all thoughts or opinions are the same. But I should at least try to understand what's there. And then maybe I'll have a say in the education of that child that you gave birth to. That nuance and that complexity that language gives us is let go for menace, kind of gun to the head theory of language. Language static, it must mean this. Oppressive language doesn't more than represent violence. It is violence. Some people get upset with this kind of idea of violence extending into the symbolic realm because like it demeans or it lessens the real violence that people experience. I don't think that this is right. At least not as a rule. I think that if you think about the violence that happens in some kind of oppressive language, you better understand how we get the physical manifestations of violence. I would almost say that I believe as a rule, you really don't get to physical violence, physical intentional violence, without some symbolic violence supporting it. Doesn't mean it always goes in that direction. But in a long enough way, a kind of oppressive theory of meaning and language and relating to other human beings leads to violence. So I won't even necessarily always distinguish them as two distinct phenomenon. But sometimes you need to, sometimes you don't. See different things depending on what you do. Physical violence is the consequence. Yeah, I would say that's kind of what I'm saying. Physical violence is the consequence of thinking in these really static ways. This is a border. This imaginary line is a border, but I'm going to make it real. How do you make a border feel real? You put a lot of people there with guns. Where do those borders come from originally? Symbolic. Communication, treaties, and war, and all those other things. But there's an interesting kind of transformation when borders used to be more vague. The mountains, that river, kind of borders. And once you have to make borders exact and precise, someone who's living on one side of the border who doesn't really like, oh crap, and now they're subjected to this violence. So sometimes it works that way. It's not even just like violent speech. It's that kind of enforcement of a certain exactness or precision in language isn't always a good thing. I think you sometimes can get violence out of being really, and this is more what George Orwell talks about when he's criticizing oppressive language, say, on the English language. Of it like smears over the differences between things, but it can go also the other way, of like the enforcement of a difference. It can be either way, and then violence can result. A lot of examples of that in history. I don't need to name any because to name one would suggest 1,000. So oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. Does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. Whether it is obscuring state language or the faux language of mindless media, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science, whether it is the malign language of law without ethics, or language designed for the estrangement of minorities, hiding its racist plunder in its literary cheek, it must be rejected, altered, and exposed. The thing is, though, with those three things that she says, rejected, altered, and exposed, I think if you just said rejected, it would seem like another static response. We can't say those words, right? The way that you kind of make words taboo, but the way that it's rejected, the rejection is just not endorsement. And then what do we have to do with that language when we confront it? We have to alter it, which means we have to understand it, study it, and maybe even use it, but for very different purposes. So we can't just throw up our hands and say bad word. It's kind of a child's way of relating to language, right? You're not allowed to say those things. You can see children get confused. When, like, I remember we weren't supposed to say hell as kids. And then I got confused because in school, in religion class, which was supposed to be, because I went to a Catholic school, supposed to be the most holy class, they would sometimes say the word hell. Of course, referring to it. And I'd be like, that's a bad word. And in some sense, that kind of like, that the stupidity of me as a child, of not understanding the difference, could actually be helpful, of being like, it kind of shows the stupidity of the idea of something as a bad word. It's not really the word, is it? It's not really what was bad. It always depends on the context. So, it is the language that drinks blood, laps vulnerabilities, tucks its fascist boots under crinolines of respectability, patriotism, as it moves relentlessly toward the bottom line and the bottomed out mind. A little bit of rhyme in there, too. So we got alliteration, we got rhyme, half rhyme, bottom line and bottomed out mind. Sexist language, racist language, theistic language, all are typical of the policing languages of mastery and do not permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. The old woman is keenly aware that no intellectual mercenary, no insatiable dictator, no paid-for politician or demagogue, no counterfeit journalist would be persuaded by her thought. There is and will be rousing language to keep citizens armed and arming, slaughtered and slaughtering, in the malls, courthouses, post offices, playgrounds, bedrooms, and boulevards. Stirring, memorializing language to mask the pity, waste, needless death. You ever think about that? That all of the honor shown to the fallen dead is really propaganda for the next war. They died an honorable death. It almost doesn't really matter the details of what happened, right? No one ever says, well, how did they die? A lot in the United States, a lot of the recent death of soldiers has been from friendly fire. That doesn't seem a particularly honorable way to die to me. In training, there is one case where Raytheon, big missile company. They said that, well, the story was controversial, but it was at some base. And it turned out later that Raytheon was testing out its calibration. Several soldiers were killed in this test that was disguised and covered up later. Huh. Is it honorable? Just because if you die with a uniform on, it's honorable. But that could be helpful if what you want to do is convince people that it's good to die for your cause. When your cause is not clear, when it's not argued for, when it's not substantiated. There will be more diplomatic language to countenance rape, torture, assassination. There is and will be more seductive mutant language designed to throttle women, to pack their throats like pate-producing geese, with their own unsayable, transgressive words. That's a complicated image. But you know, when they make foie gras, the classical way of doing this is to force feed the geese fatty livers. There will be more of the language of surveillance disguised as research. That's everywhere. He's right on the money with it. Of politics and history calculated to render the suffering of millions mute. Language glamorized to thrill the dissatisfied and bereft into assaulting their neighbors. Arrogant pseudo-empirical language crafted to lock creative people into cases of inferiority, hopelessness. Underneath the eloquence, the glamour, scholarly associations, however stirring or seductive, the heart of such language is languishing. Another little effect that such language is languishing, or perhaps not beating at all if the bird is already dead. Which brings us back to that initial image of the bird. Do we know whether it's alive or not? We don't. But the point is, it's our responsibility. She has thought about what could have been the intellectual history of any discipline if it had not been insisted upon or been forced into the waste of time and life that rationalizations for and representations of dominance required. Lethal discourses of exclusion, blocking access to cognition for both the excluder and the excluded. The conventional wisdom of the Tower of Babel story, this is a story from the Bible, is that the collapse was a misfortune. So let's just quickly go through that story. People try to build a tower to God. God gets angry at this hubris. You can't build a tower to me. And so he destroys the tower. When he's destroying the tower, he also destroys the tongues of the people. They had one tongue. And so this is the theory, the biblical theory of the origins of different languages. It's a punishment. That it was the distraction or the weight of many languages that precipitated the tower's failed architecture. That one monolithic language would have expedited the building, and heaven would have been reached. Whose heaven, she wonders? What kind? Perhaps the achievement of paradise was premature, a little hasty. If no one could take the time to understand other languages, other views, other narratives, period. Had they, the heaven they imagined might have been found at their feet. Complicated, demanding, yes. A view of heaven as life, not heaven post-life. I mean, that's a deep and rich vein that she taps into. Another way you could think about it, I mean, there's lots of different, theories of the afterlife, different theological and religious traditions. One from the Christian tradition is the beatific vision, and this is the idea that the pleasure of heaven is seeing God. But then people kind of had the issue of like, well, is it just kind of a static vision? You just look at God's face and it's the same all the time. And some people are like, yeah, but it's so great. You wouldn't want to look away. So it's okay to do that for eternity. But then there was another view of heaven as infinite depth. That divinity, that to live within divinity would be to be in an infinite depth, an ever richer, ever deeper motion into love. You might think to yourself, what appeals more to you? A vision of heaven as an eternal screensaver, God's face, or an infinite richness of love? Is it more the angels' choir or the heavenly throne? What's your heaven look like? She would not want to leave her young visitors with the impression that language should be forced to stay alive merely to be. The vitality of language lies in its ability to limn the actual, imagined and possible lives of its speakers, readers, writers. Neither. I like that answer, aliens. What would be your view of heaven or of some kind of paradise? Would it be more about one thing or many things? I wrote a short story about this once, about the kind of like horror of eternity. I'm not going to go into it. I'm curious what you think. What would be more heavenly? Variation or sameness? Mortality is what gives meaning to enjoyment. Okay, well, there we were in 100% agreement. Yeah. And I think that's kind of why she says paradise as life, not as post-life. That the limit and the ending of life is required for enjoyment. Everyone always says this when we talk about this topic of mortality and enjoyment, but French, petit mort, for orgasm, the little death. That orgasm being an experience of death. Common in lots of cultures. Maybe there's something in that to think about. So, infinite anything is torture. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. I don't love the idea of the infinite. Borges, speaking of another great literary, I think he did win the Nobel Prize as well. If you want to experience all the variations on infinity as torture, but it does, sometimes he says good things too about infinity. You should read the short stories of Borges. He is the great literary master of thinking about infinity. Georg Cantor was the great mathematical master. Borges was the literary master. But of course, we're talking against mastery here. So I mean master in a different sense than that. Master in the sense of creative, non-static thinking about. In the show The Good Place? Oh, I've heard that mentioned. Maybe I should watch that. I think that's on Netflix or something. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I've only really heard it mentioned, and people seem to like it, but I don't really know too much about it. Yeah, that could be cool. Although its poise is sometimes in displacing experience, it is not a substitute for it. It arcs toward the place where meaning may lie. It arcs toward the place where meaning may lie. You ever think about that? When you say something and someone misunderstands, you say, "Oh, that's not what I meant to say." Well, where's the meaning? A lot of people think the meaning's in my head. But then why did it come out in the words? Why did the other person not get it? They're never going to be in your head. So maybe meaning's not in your head. When a president of the United States thought about the graveyard his country had become and said, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here." Of course, this is Abraham. His simple words are exhilarating in their life-sustaining properties because they refuse to encapsulate the reality of 600,000 dead men in a cataclysmic race war. Refusing to monumentalize, disdaining the final word, the precise summing up, acknowledging their poor power to add or detract, his words signal deference to the uncapturability of the life it mourns. It is the deference that moves her, the recognition that language can never live up to life once and for all, nor should it. Language can never pin down slavery, genocide, or war, nor should it yearn for the arrogance to be able to do so. Its force, its felicity, is in its reach toward the ineffable. And what is the ineffable? That which cannot be said. And just like you were saying, aliens, where life and enjoyment comes precisely from the possibility of dying, so too meaning comes precisely from pointing to what cannot be articulated. That's kind of her argument. It's about a woman who accidentally sent the good place, heaven, and tries her best to learn how to be a good person from an indecisive ethics professor. Actually, that sounds very funny. I feel like an ethics professor is being like who you meet in heaven is a good comic scenario. I like that. So maybe I'll check it out. I wonder if it will live up to the. You need good writers to make that really, really work, but that's a funny premise. I like that a lot. Be it grand or slender, burrowing, blasting, or refusing to sanctify, whether it laughs out loud or is a cry without an alphabet. Cry without an alphabet. Pretty good at this stuff. The choice word, the chosen silence, unmolested language surges toward knowledge, not its destruction. But who does not know of literature banned because it is interrogative, discredited because it is critical, erased because alternate? How many are outraged by this thought of a self-ravaged tongue? I'm not sure exactly I understand that image, the self-ravaged tongue. That one's beyond me. Do you have any theory about what she's talking about there? Word work is sublime, because it is generative. I like this phrase, word work, as opposed to just words, speech, word work. Cry is one of those sounds that communicate without a language. Indeed, one of the theories of the origin of language that comes up a lot is that it kind of comes out of a cry, and that the cry communicates to others. Fear of an animal often is what is imagined. But we all kind of begin language crying, don't we, as babies? But so our cry communicates before we know that it communicates, which is another reason to show that meaning doesn't exist in our head. The baby doesn't cry because it's like, give me my bottle. It learns that when it cries, a bottle arrives. Or something happens, you know. That's part of why it's so deeply personal, language. All of us, at the same time that it's can never only be personal. Little variations in our experience color our sense of the meaning of language in some way. So the baby cries, something happens, meaning is being made there, but it's not coming from the baby's head. Except the cry is, I guess, in some physical way. We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language. That may be the measure of our life. Somebody already in the Discord, in the public speaking section where we're reading this, mentioned this as the sentence that illuminated something. This is a difficult sentence. Maybe I should pause here and say something about it. Is the meaning of life that we die? Seems kind of, at first, that might seem kind of dour. So that's it? There's nothing else? But I think it goes back again to what Aliens has been saying in the chat, that it couldn't be meaningful if it were just, it's like if music isn't meaningful, if it's just a single tone that's in the background, or even a tone that varies, you're like, this doesn't feel like music unless you can anticipate an end to it. That the movement of music, which is meaningful, is always movement towards an end. It doesn't necessarily mean that the end has to be like right around the corner, that it's moving towards something. It's more like memento mori. I could say quite a bit about that. Because I work on Baroque melancholy, where memento mori is a big deal. And in the memento mori, there's so many variations on the memento mori, but you could think about it very broadly. Well, what does it mean? It kind of is a command for someone to think about their death. And often you have like a picture of a skull, or like a fading rose. And so on the one hand, memento mori was used for the purposes of Christian culture to get people to repent. Think about your death. You have to repent before you're dead so that you don't go to hell. Okay, and that might be the basement level theory of the memento mori. But I think what it became was something far greater, which is that everything shares transient. We wanted to say something we all have in common. In fact, things that we have in common with things that are not human is that we're all going away. And that common background colors the way that we recognize difference. That might be another way where thinking about death makes possible meaning. I don't want to go too far into that, because that kind of stuff gets me excited, and then I just ramble on about all sorts of obscure references. Try not to do that. Let's stay with Toni. But what does it mean that language is the measure? I mean, it might be in some kind of, again, literal-minded way. Oh, it's the measure of your life. You're a Nobel Prize winner. Literature. But what is it the measure of all of our lives? Is it because of what we say or what people will say about us? Or is it not really about speech? Is it about language and what contribution have we made to the way that things can be thought or spoken about? That might not necessarily be only in speaking. It might be in something that you make. What's that mark upon the world that makes possible seeing a new difference or seeing a new place where things come together that people do? all of those things, whether they are technology, whether they are creation of a community, they are in some sense carried in language and through language. Once upon a time, story, visitors ask an old woman a question. Who are they, these children? What did they make of that encounter? What did they hear in those final words? The bird is in your... A sentence that gestures toward possibility, or one that drops a latch. A sentence that gestures toward possibility, or one that drops a latch. Are you trying, sometimes in debate, where there's another place people get trained to speak, I would say the bad training in debate is that you want to kind of arrive with an argument that's so powerful that the fantasy is that the other side will get up and have nothing to say. This is a really dangerous way to train people to speak. It's a much better way to think about how can I say something that will inspire new and different kinds of speech, that will kind of force my lazy or tired opponent to come up with a new response, one that they may not have expected themselves to have to make. And if they can't make it, then maybe they do lose the game. But the possibility of that extra move is still there. It's one of the reasons I love chess so much. I haven't talked a lot about chess on this channel, but don't worry. I could become a Twitch chess streamer. It might even happen. Who knows? I love playing chess. And one of the amazing things about chess is that no matter how deeply you study its history, there are always, always, always more possibilities. And learning how to think in terms of possibility, rather than in terms of rules that are always necessary, is one of the signs of the beginner in chess versus someone who's experienced. The beginner kind of has to start out with an idea of the chessboard in terms of its rules, what can be moved where. So there are those kinds of limitations that make the game possible. But within those limitations, there's a near infinite amount of variation of possibilities. So a lot of those don't need to be explored because they're very clearly bad. If you get experience, you can see. I don't need to think about the bad moves unless you're doing some other thing with the game. Maybe you're trying to create a variation on chess. There's a game called anti-chess, which is where you try to get checkmated. So maybe in that game, other possibilities would be there. Chess and intercollegiate debate are often compared, but it's always really a bad comparison. Great stuff. It's kind of a... I'm not sure what you're saying there, but I guess I am saying that they're different, right? That, but yeah, I would say that maybe they're compared because in the life world of people, the kind of people who like do chess and the kind of people who do debate might be similar types of people. But yeah, I really don't think that they're very similar. I don't think that they're very similar. I think I'm more interested in chess pedagogy right now, because how do you move beyond that question of like someone's really starting out and they're like you can't overwhelm them with huge amounts of like classical games or opening theory. These kinds of stuff would just kind of really turn someone off. And in one of the chess video channels I like, which is Ben Feingold's Chess Club and Scholastic Center of Atlanta, his wife sometimes is streaming, and she's, you know, like more or less a novice chess player. And on one stream, she said something that was where people were asking questions about like, what should I learn first? Should I learn opening theory? And her stepson was like, probably not. Like it's too deep, and you kind of was like, and she's like, well, one thing I want to add, which is if chess theory is something that excites you, you should keep studying it, because the most important thing is find a reason to keep doing this, because it's more easy to get discouraged. And so even though she wasn't a master, she was kind of very wise in that moment, being like the most important thing for someone who's learning is motivation, not like a specific strategy. It's not only about winning, it's about staying in the game. I thought that was pretty cool. And I think I'm like, wow, that's, you don't hear people in I mean, maybe you, Steve, but you don't hear a lot of people in debate talking that way. How do we keep people in the game? People are concerned about the numbers of women that are retained. I don't think people think about like, what could you study that would keep you excited? I don't know, maybe they do, and maybe I'm just not party to that conversation. So here's what Toni Morrison says. A sentence that gestures towards possibility, or one that drops a latch. Perhaps what the children heard was, it's not my problem. I'm an old female black blind. What wisdom I have now is in knowing I cannot help you. Future of languages. Future of languages. Channel ends. Peace be with you. But the speech doesn't end. They stand there. Suppose nothing was in their hands. Suppose the visit was only a ruse. Then maybe they don't have a bird at all. It's not dead or alive. There's no bird. A trick to get to be spoken to, taken seriously as they have not been before. A chance to interrupt, to violate the adult world, its miasma of discourse about them, for them, but never to them. Urgent questions are at stake, including the one that they have asked. Is the bird we hold living or dead? Now, Morrison brilliantly turns it back. She says, we began with this as a cruel question, but maybe in a way that they didn't understand. It is an urgent question. It didn't mean what they thought it meant. No trick at all. No silliness. A straightforward question, worthy of the attention of a wise one, an old one. And if the old and wise, who have lived life and faced death, cannot describe either, who can? But she does not. She keeps her secret, her good opinion of herself, her gnomic pronouncement of oracular stuff, her art without commitment. She keeps her distance, enforces it, and retreats into the singularity of isolation, sophisticated, privileged space. Now she's kind of taking this strange view of the wise woman as someone who maybe has responsibility as well. Nothing, no word follows her declaration of transfer. That silence is deep, deeper than the meaning available in the words she has spoken. It shivers, this silence. Children, annoyed, fill it with language invented on the spot. Now this is, if you're coming to this from my classes, or if you've watched previous streams, you'll see that this is a weirdly common thing for people who are deeply invested in language, who are thinking about language, keep going back to language and its relationship to silence. Not as language, silence not as the privation of language, the absence of language, but as the source of language and meaning in some weird way. It keeps coming up. Maybe it's something worth reflecting on. That the language that we experience in silence of what cannot be said shapes the language that we use in such a way that gives it deeper significance. Rather than words being little cars that carry little tiny meanings that all get to a big meaning, which is the meaning I have in my head. That's not what's happening. It's a kind of gesture that points to something that can't be said. Or maybe doesn't point. Maybe snarls, grimaces at something. Cannot be spoken. Is there no speech, they ask her? No words you can give us that help us break through your dossier of failures? So at this point we can say this isn't really about a blind old woman. This is her reflecting on herself, which makes sense. It's her award speech. But reflecting on herself not as just Toni Morrison, but as a kind of person, someone who is a custodian of language, which could be anybody. Maybe particularly writers, maybe particularly people who have made a profession. But it could be anybody, right? Why wouldn't we all care about language? It's in our care. We're the users of it. What do you use that you don't have to care for? Who's doing the caring for it? You just use something until it breaks, and then you call the repairman? Maybe we do. But maybe it's harder because with language, it's not so clear. It doesn't like stop working in the way when your water main breaks, you're like, oh crap, I gotta call the repairman. It's not that kind of discrete of a problem. All of that static. It's when it stops moving. And you can actually become fixated in the symbol systems. Static. They can actually give you a certain kind of, as she said, what was it? Narcotic narcissism. To the barrier you have erected between generosity and wisdom. We have no bird in our hands, living or dead. We have only you and our important question. Is the nothing in our hands something you could not bear to contemplate, to even guess? Don't you remember being young when language was magic without meaning? When what you could say could not mean? When the invisible was what imagination strove to see? When questions and demands for answers burned so brightly that you trembled with fury at night? I remember that feeling. Don't answer my question. And where else could you go as a child? You think that adults have the answers. And it can be, at first, it can be a really surprising experience when nobody can answer. And you know that your question isn't stupid. But maybe that's the beginning of freedom, realizing that not every good question has already been discovered to have a good answer. The world of adults isn't finished. Do we have to begin consciousness with a battle, heroines and heroes like you have already fought and lost, leaving us with nothing in our hands except what you have imagined is there? Your answer is artful, but its artfulness embarrasses us and ought to embarrass you. Huh, interesting. What do you think that is? Your answer is indecent in its self-congratulation, a made-for-television script that makes no sense if there is nothing in our... These are the children kind of pushing back. Maybe we should push back on wisdom. Isn't wisdom one of the versions of static language? Isn't wisdom precisely the most extreme version of static language? It's said by nobody. It's said by the ancestors who haunt us but cannot be brought forward to account for what they say. Why didn't you reach out, touch us with your soft fingers, delay the soundbite, the lesson, until you knew who we were? Did you so despise our trick, our modus operandi, you could not see that we were baffled about how to get your attention? We are young, unripe. We have heard all our short lives that we have to be responsible. What could that possibly mean in the catastrophe this world has become? Whereas a poet said, nothing needs to be exposed, since it is already barefaced. Whereas the kids are saying today, mask off. Our inheritance is an affront. You want us to have your old blank eyes and see only cruelty and mediocrity. Do you think we are stupid enough to perjure ourselves again and again with the fiction of nationhood? How dare you talk to us of duty when we stand waist deep in the toxin of your past? This is a generational conflict. I don't want anyone to tell me I need to be responsible. Our world is on fire. Once again, the failure of our supposedly democratic politics to address the most glaring and immediate problems. People are literally being murdered, getting off. Murderers are getting off scot-free because of who they are. Why is it my responsibility? You trivialize us and trivialize the bird that is not in our hand. Am I responsible for something that's not there? Okay, if the bird was alive or dead, maybe I'm responsible, but there's no bird. Is there no context for our lives? No song, no literature, no poem full of vitamins, no history connected to experience that you can pass along to help us start strong? You're an adult. The old one, the wise one. Stop thinking about saving your face. Think of our lives and tell us your particularized world. Make up a story. Narrative is radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. We will not blame you if your reach exceeds your grasp. If love so ignites your words, they go down in flames and nothing is left but their scald. Or if with the reticence of a surgeon's hands, your words suture only the places where blood might flow. We know you can never do it properly, once and for all. Passion is never enough, neither is skill. But try. For our sake and yours, forget your name in the street. Tell us what the world has been to you in the dark places and in the light. Don't tell us what to believe, what to fear. Show us belief's wide skirt and the stitch that unravels fear's call. You, old woman, blessed with blindness, can speak the language that tells us what only language can, how to see without pictures. Language alone protects us from the scariness of things with no. Language alone is meditation. Whose voice is this now? Is this still the children's who visited the old woman? I think it is, but of course it's been developed. It means more than just what was in the story at first. Tell us what it is to be a woman so that we may know what it is to be a man. What moves at the margin, what it is to have no home in this place, to be set adrift from the one you knew, what it is to live at the edge of towns that cannot bear your company. Tell us about ships turned away from shorelines at Easter, placenta in a field. Each of these images is a story. Tell us about a wagon load of slaves, how they sang so softly their breath was indistinguishable from the falling snow, how they knew from the hunch of the nearest shoulder that the next stop would be their last, how with hands prayed in their sex, they thought of heat then sun, lifting their faces as though it was there for the taking. turning as though there for the taking. They stop at an inn. The driver and his mate go in with the lamp, leaving them humming in the dark. The horse's void steams into the snow. Beneath its hooves, and its hiss and melt are the envy of the freezing slaves. The inn door opens. A girl and a boy step away from its light. They climb into the wagon bed. The boy will have a gun in 3 years, but now he carries a lamp and a jug of warm cider. Pass it from mouth to mouth. The girl offers bread, pieces of meat, and something more, a glance into the eyes of the one she serves. One helping for each man, two for each woman, and a look. They look back. The next stop will be their last. Not this one. This one is warmed. It's quiet again when the children finish speaking, until the woman breaks into the silence. Finally, she says, I trust you now. I trust you with the bird that is not in your hands, because you have truly caught it. Look. How lovely it is. This thing we have. It's not the first time I've read it. Obviously, I signed it. Today it feels different. Exactly. I think I'll leave it there for today. I hope you've gotten something out of this stream or the video if you're coming to it later on YouTube at Rhetoric Prof. Please let me know if you're interested in more content like this. Opinions or thoughts that were. You can participate in the next live stream here on Twitch. You can also join my Discord server, which is available on Twitch. I'll have it up there. Or you can leave me a comment on YouTube. There's lots of ways to get in touch. And I hope that you do. Maybe we'll learn to catch no birds. See you next time.